Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum, and I welcome you and those watching on the live stream on behalf of my colleagues here at the museum and at Mass Audubon, our partner in our current temporary exhibit, Alive with Birds, William Brewster in Concord. As if our world was not troubled enough, we now learn, or at least those of us like me who had my head in the sand, and I suppose I should not be surprised that migratory birds are also being threatened terribly by climate change and other environmental degradations. Here this evening to describe the majesty and unfathomable endurance that defines bird migration and the current challenges that various species face is renowned ornithologist and author Scott Weidensaul. Mr. Weidensaul is the author of nearly 30 books, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Living on the Wind, and the New York Times bestseller, A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds, which will be the focus of his talk this evening. And the book will be on sale afterwards, and he's happy to sign your copies. The miracle of birds meets the miracle of technology, writes Jane Alexander about this new wondrous book. While there are huge gaps in our knowledge of migration, in despair in our race to save species, advances in technology are changing the equation and making the future look hopeful, she concludes. In addition to writing about wildlife, Mr. Weidensaul is an active field researcher and serves as a co-director of Project OwlNet, a collaborative effort among 125 banding and research stations across North America studying owl migration, and Project Snowstorm, which uses cutting-edge tracking technology to study snowy owls. He's also part of a continental effort to understand the rapid evolution by several species of western hummingbirds of a new migratory route and wintering range in the east. After Scott's opening presentation, he'll be joined on stage by David O'Neill, president of Mass Audubon. Prior to coming to Massachusetts, David served as the Chief Conservation Officer and Senior Advisor to the CEO of National Audubon Society, where he led the development of conservation strategies. As president of Mass Audubon, David is focusing on climate change, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, and protecting habitats for birds and other wildlife. So please join me now in welcoming Scott Weidensaul to Concord.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Still at the point where being in a room full of other people is equal parts exciting and slightly freaking me out, but you all seem relatively harmless. And look at that, the technology works. It's always a little bit of a surprise too. I'd like to talk about migration tonight, and it's a perfect time of the year to be talking about migration. We are just coming into the peak of the spring migration. How many birders do we have here? Okay, is there anybody here who doesn't like birds? Okay, because this would be a hostile audience for you probably. I have been fascinated by birds and bird migration my entire life. I grew up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania where I lived up until just a couple of years ago when Amy got lured away by Mass Audubon, my wife Amy, who's sitting in the back there, and who works for David, and so I'm being very careful about what I say. But I got hooked on bird migration 50 years ago last fall when I was 12 years old at a place called Hawk Mountain in eastern Pennsylvania, the world's first sanctuary for birds of prey, on this high ridge top on the Kittatinny Ridge, along which every year a flood of about 20,000 hawks, eagles, and falcons migrates on their way south. And my first trip to Hawk Mountain when I was 12 years old was a perfect migration day when the sky was just full of migrating raptors, and I got hooked on raptors because birds of prey are the coolest of all birds, as all right-thinking people know. I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains along which these birds were migrating and among which I had grown up. But most of all, I got hooked on the phenomenon of migration. And that's been really the focus of both my personal and professional life ever since. As Tom mentioned, back in the 90s, I wrote a book called Living on the Wind, where I followed bird migration up and down the Western Hemisphere, writing about what we knew about the science of migration at that point and the conservation challenges that birds were facing. But that's been almost 25 years since that book came out, and things have changed significantly, both in our understanding of the physiology and science of migration and orientation and how birds can do the things they do, and also the challenges worldwide that are facing migratory birds. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I headed back out again, this time at global scale, to write about where things stand right now for bird migration, because migratory birds are in crisis, as Tom mentioned. 3 years ago, the top ornithologists in the US calculated that we've lost about a third of our birds since 1970, almost 3 billion individual fewer birds today than there were when I was a 12-year-old kid sitting on those rocks. And I don't want to be a total buzzkill right out of the gates here this evening, and I promise you this is the only chart I'm going to show you, because charts are kind of boring. But it's important to understand what we're up against. This is a graph from that science paper in 2019 that shows the fate of different habitat groups of birds in North America. And you can see that the group of birds that are in the worst trouble are grassland birds, birds like bobolinks and meadowlarks and upland sandpipers and many of the grassland sparrows. And it's not a mystery why this is the case. We've destroyed or altered most of our native grassland and prairie habitat in North America. But there's actually a reason for hope, believe it or not, in looking at this graph. Look at what happened at the other end of the chart. Look what happened up at the top. Waterfowl, like ducks and geese and swans, and water birds like herons and egrets and ibis have rebounded dramatically in the last 50 years. And the reason for that, again, is not a mystery. Starting in the mid-'80s, when waterfowl populations were cratering because of habitat loss and drought, we as a society began pouring an enormous amount of time and effort and money and regulatory muscle into preserving and enhancing wetland habitat. And if you build it, they will come. Those birds responded dramatically. We can do the same thing for grassland birds, the birds that are in the worst trouble in North America, because it is predominantly a habitat issue. So birds like greater prairie chickens like these and all the other species that depend on those grassland habitats, we can bring them back if we as a society put the same effort and time and money and resources into protecting those habitats. It's important for us to realize, I think, at a time when it can seem really bleak, that all around the world, people are moving the dial in a positive direction for migratory birds. In some places where, almost literally at the last possible moment. For example, one of the places I traveled working on this new book was the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula. The Yellow Sea is one of the most, arguably maybe the most important migratory stopover point in the world, where birds that have traveled for thousands of miles and have thousands of miles yet to go can stop and rest and feed and refuel. And so you have birds coming from as far away as New Zealand and Australia and the islands of the South Pacific on their way to breeding grounds in Asia or Alaska or the Yukon, stopping off for a couple of weeks, having just flown 6,000 miles nonstop, to feed on the mudflats of the Yellow Sea. These are the largest mudflats in the world. This is Dongling, north of Shanghai, and when the tide goes out at Dongling, it goes out for like 20 kilometers. And you look at the mud, and it looks utterly lifeless, but under the surface, it's this buffet of macroinvertebrates and tiny little mollusks on which birds that have arrived at the ragged edge of starvation can rapidly rebuild their weight and make another 4,000 or 5,000 mile nonstop flight. The problem is there's far fewer of those mudflats than there were just a few decades ago. In China, about 60 or 70% of those tidal mudflats have been, well, the term is reclaimed, but it's just basically coastal destruction. They build seawalls, they pump in hundreds of millions of cubic meters of sediment to create dry land for industrial sites or cities, or deep water aquaculture ponds like this that aren't useful for the birds. And the birds are suffering for it. About 11 to 13 million shorebirds pass through the Yellow Sea every year. But we're kind of at a point now where it's a birds per hectare equation, in the words of one of the conservationists I met with there. For every additional acre of mudflat that's destroyed, birds die. And the bird that is in the deepest trouble here and has become kind of the poster child for Yellow Sea conservation is this bird. This is a spoon-billed sandpiper, the weirdest of all of the world's shorebirds. It's about the size of our semi-palmated sandpiper, about 6 inches long. It has this weird spatulate bill that it uses for sieving food out of the mud. There are only, at most, 600 of these birds left in the world. They breed in the Russian Far East. They winter in Southeast Asia, and twice a year they stop off in the Yellow Sea on the Chinese side of the sea in order to feed and refuel and molt. Without the yellow sea, these birds go away completely. And so they have become, as I said, the poster child for yellow sea conservation, with domestic conservation organizations like Spoonbill Sandpiper in China that was co-founded by Xing Li here, international organizations like BirdLife International, American groups like the Paulson Institute, Hank Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, who's an ardent conservationist, working the back channels with the Chinese government to try to get them to save what's left of the Yellow Sea. And it worked. I went over there in the spring of 2018 expecting this was going to be the most depressing chapter of my new book to write. And just before I got there, the Chinese government astonished everybody by declaring a nearly complete moratorium on any further coastal destruction on the Chinese side of the Yellow Sea. And then they followed that up over the next 2 years by nominating 24 of the most important shorebird sites for UNESCO World Heritage Protection. And just last year, the South Koreans have done the same thing for 4 or 5 of the most important sites on the South Korean side of the Yellow Sea. And so during my time there in 2018, I found people like Xing grappling with this very unfamiliar emotion, which was hope. In fact, my friend Tunis Piersma, who's been studying these birds there for decades, said, "I thought my job was to document the extinction of these birds." And he said, "Now, I hope I have enough life left to see their recovery." But you don't have to be, the head of a powerful totalitarian government who can make sweeping declarations on behalf of birds to do good things for migratory birds. One of the most remarkable stories I had the chance to report on in the course of doing this book took place in one of the most remote places I've ever traveled among very, very poor people. And these are the mountains of Nagaland in northeastern India. That's that little bit of India that kind of sticks up between Burma, Myanmar to the south, and China to the north. And every year in this ruggedly mountainous, densely forested area, millions and millions of Amur falcons gather on their migration. Now, these are about the size of our American kestrel. They're an primarily insectivorous falcon. They breed in northern China, Mongolia, Siberia, and they have the longest migration of any bird of prey on the planet, about 18,000 miles a year, including the longest overwater crossing of any bird of prey, 2,400 miles nonstop across the Indian Ocean to get to their wintering grounds in southern Africa. And the reason they stop off in Nagaland in October and early November is because at the end of the seasonal monsoon rains, trillions of termites emerge from underground on their mating flights, these big, juicy termites, winged termites, that are the perfect food for a bird that's got to fly across an ocean so that they can fill up their tanks. We knew nothing about this until 10 years ago, we in the outside world. We knew nothing about this massive migration of millions of Amur falcons gathering in huge numbers every year in Nagaland. We only know about it now because in the fall of 2012, a small group of Indian conservationists followed up on rumors of almost mind-bogglingly great numbers of falcons in a remote part of Nagaland, and they went to explore. And they found those falcons. But they also found that the local communities were killing about 140,000, 150,000 of them at the peak of the migration every year. Now, this is not a traditional subsistence hunt. They hadn't started doing this until about 10 years earlier, when a huge hydroelectric dam was built in the valley, flooding their farm fields. And for reasons we don't really understand, the birds began concentrating at night in dense nocturnal roosts. And the people figured, well, we can't farm here anymore. We can't even fish in this lake because it's full of dead trees, but we can string our nets in the trees, catch these birds, kill them, smoke them, sell them in bigger towns for money, and pay for our kids' education, because that's what you have to, if you want to send your kid to school beyond 3rd grade, you have to pay for it. Well, as you can imagine, the world was horrified when they found out about this. Amur falcons are common, but they are not that common. I mean, they would be in serious population trouble pretty quickly if this continued. But it didn't. In part because this was technically an illegal hunt, and the authorities have been turning a blind eye to it, but mostly because Indian conservationists and other conservation groups sat down with the Naga elders and communities like Pangti and explained to them that what you're doing is going to destroy these birds. And they said, we didn't know. We'll stop. And they did, completely, 1 year to the next. 140,000 dead falcons 1 year, virtually none the next year. And within 2 years, the world went from condemning them for their barbarity to praising them for their conservation leadership. But here's the thing. One of the reasons that they turned away from hunting so quickly is because people also said, this is one of the greatest wildlife spectacles on Earth. People are going to want to come to see this. Tourists are going to want to come to see this. But let me tell you something, folks. It is not easy getting to Nagaland. That is one of the better stretches of road, and that is an active landslide zone right there. I mean, periodically that mountain just lets loose, the whole thing falls down, God forbid if you're the one on the road when it goes, and then they just bulldoze another road through there until the next time. And incidentally, that slope goes down for several hundred feet more out of the picture. I have traveled on some really bad roads in this world. I don't think I've ever been quite as frightened as I was on this road. Oh, but did I mention armed bandits and also Maoist cross-border insurgents coming in from Myanmar? There was a firefight between insurgents and the Indian military just a few weeks before we were there that left 40 people dead. It's a dangerous place to get to, but it is also worth the trip. I have seen some of the biggest concentrations of birds of prey on the planet. I was part of the team that first documented the world's largest raptor migration in Veracruz, Mexico back in 1992, but I've never seen anything like this. To watch 50, 60, 100,000 falcons come rising up out of just one roost site, out of many roost sites up and down this Doyong River Valley. Just, you know, before daybreak, when you're walking back through the high elephant grass, and by the way, you can hear wild elephants bugling in the distance, you just hear this rushing of high wind overhead, and it's actually just the sound of tens of thousands of falcons roaring, you know, their wings scything through the air overhead. An absolutely extraordinary thing. And while tourism has been slow to catch on in Nagaland, the people in Pangti and those surrounding villages take great pride now in calling themselves the falcon capital of the world. In fact, many of the former trappers have formed what they call the Amur Falcon Roost Area Union, both to guide visitors who are coming there and also to protect those roosts that they once hunted. I am cautiously optimistic about the future for migratory birds, and there's a couple of reasons for that, not just because of extraordinary things like the folks in Nagaland have done, but because we have technologies at our fingertips today that are allowing us to finally kind of open up the black box of migration. Migration is the most dangerous and least understood part of a bird's annual cycle. But we have enough computing power now that we can really start to crunch these enormous data sets. Like, for example, the Doppler weather radar system. Guaranteed that the National Weather Service, when they built the Doppler radar network back in the 80s, did not intend this to be a powerful tool for ornithology. But at night, you can calculate with precision how many birds are migrating over the lower 48 because these Doppler weather stations, in addition to telling you whether there's a thunderstorm or a blizzard coming, can tell you precisely how many birds per cubic meter of airspace are passing overhead. And most birds migrate at night, when it's always been almost impossible to track their movements. That tells us how many birds are up there. It doesn't tell us what they are. Radar is taxonomically agnostic, in the words of one scientist I talked to. So to fill in the details, you need other forms of big data, and the most important by far is eBird. How many eBirders do we have here? How many people have no idea what I'm talking about? Okay, eBird is the world's largest wildlife observation database. Every year, birders contribute about 100 million sightings to this enormous database at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And what it does is it allows us to layer that eBird data and radar data and habitat data, and scientists can start to model with precision just exactly where and in what number and in what density, at what time of the year these birds are. This is a distribution map for yellow warblers, one of the most common widespread warblers in North America. Watch what happens. It's going to go north again here. I want you to watch Louisiana right here in the fall when these birds start coming south. Watch how Louisiana lights up. If I were interested in conservation of yellow warblers, that tells me that's a place where I ought to be focused on land conservation and habitat protection. And this kind of information is allowing us to target our very scarce conservation dollars in new and important ways. In his introduction, Tom mentioned something about tracking technology. This is something I've been really involved in for the last 25 years. And it's just revolutionary. He mentioned Project Snowstorm. This is something that a bunch of colleagues of mine and I started about 9 years ago to study the winter movement ecology and migration of snowy owls. And so over the last 9 years, we've put these GPS, GSM transmitters that are about the size of a matchbox on more than 100 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces. They're solar powered. They operate using two technologies most of you have in your pocket right now. They communicate with the GPS satellite system overhead, and they record latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed as frequently as every 6 seconds. And then a couple times a week, they dial up through the cell phone network, and they send us all of that data through the GSM cell network. My friends are demonstrably cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And by the way, if you're interested in this, all the data, all the tracking data for all these owls is at www.projectsnowstorm.org. This project is funded entirely by small, tax-deductible, crowd-funded contributions. That we do a GoFundMe campaign every year to raise the money for this. And so all the data that we collect is publicly available. We don't tell you where the owl is right now. We delay everything by about 24 hours to protect the owl. But it's been really, really cool. And it's great if you're tracking an owl that weighs 4.5 or 5 pounds because you can put a 1 ounce transmitter on their back. If you put a 45-gram transmitter on the back of a 30-gram Swainson's thrush, that Swainson's thrush ain't going anywhere. Until recently, it was almost impossible to track most migratory birds, which are fairly small, across any distance. But today we've got something called the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System, and Mass Audubon's been very involved in collaborating with us on this. It's a combination of really, really tiny little radio transmitters. I mean, literally, some of these are small enough you can put them on monarch butterflies or migratory dragonflies. And then they're tracked using these automated receiver stations that look like somebody forgot to take down their old-fashioned television antenna. There are now something like 1,300 of these receiver stations, mostly in eastern North America, but that is changing very, very rapidly throughout Western North America, the Caribbean, across Latin America, and increasingly in Europe and parts of Asia. And here again, all of the tracking data from all of the 36,000 individuals of more than 400 species of birds and bats and bugs that have been tagged is publicly available at www.modis.org. Modis is the Latin word for movement, so it doesn't stand for anything. It's and this is the brainchild of Birds Canada. Been a wonderful, wonderful collaboration. The other thing that we're discovering is we keep learning more and more about the physiological abilities of migratory birds. And this is, to me, some of the most astonishing stuff that we've learned about migration in recent years. Even the smallest birds do incredible things. This is a semi-palmated sandpiper, 6 inches long, weighs a little bit more than an ounce. And this bird, there's the population that breeds in eastern and central Canada, makes a 3,300-mile nonstop flight every fall, taking off from the northeastern coast of North America and flying for 4 or 5 days with no food or water or rest, all the way to their wintering grounds on the northeastern coast of South America. That's the equivalent of a human being running 126 consecutive marathons. You know, a couple of years ago, some guy broke the 4-hour record for running a marathon, and he was hailed as superhuman, which is great, but he's still distinctly subavian. And in fact, it has always kind of burned me up when I hear people comparing human athletes to birds, you know, because the birds just leave the people in the dust. If you think about arguably the most elite human athlete is a Tour de France cyclist at peak condition. This guy is operating at 4 or 5 times his base metabolic rate, and he can only do that for relatively short periods of time, certainly less than a day, and only with regular food and hydration. That semi-palm sandpiper, whose resting body temperature is 104 degrees, is operating at 9 or 10 times its base metabolic rate as it's flying across the Western Atlantic, and as I said, it's doing it for 4 or 5 days at a stretch without a break. But there is one similarity between those semi-palm sandpipers and at least some human athletes. These birds that are coming out of the eastern and central Canadian Arctic, many of them stop off on the Bay of Fundy on their way south. It's a staging ground for them. There are huge mud flats there as at the Yellow Sea, and in that mud are trillions and trillions of tiny little crustaceans called corophium. And the semi-palms actually seek out and preferentially feed on these corophium. Now, I cannot tell you for sure. Maybe they taste really good. I've never tried them. But we do know that carophium are very high in omega-3 fatty acids, and those omega-3 fatty acids supercharge the aerobic capacity of the bird's flight muscles. So they're basically juicing on performance-enhancing drugs, but what they're doing is illegal. We've also learned a huge amount about how birds are able to navigate and orient when they migrate. These have been some of the biggest mysteries about migratory birds. We've known for years that birds have a whole series of fallback mechanisms that they rely on, that they use celestial orientation, not the pattern of the stars over the night sky, the way the ancient mariners did, but the fact that one part of the night sky doesn't appear to rotate, and of course that shows them where Polaris is. We know that seabirds can navigate across thousands of miles of ocean, basically smelling their way back home, that birds can use low-frequency sound waves. Diurnal migrants like hawks use the position and movement of the sun across the sky. But the most mysterious of all of their migratory cues has always been their magnetic sense. Scientists have known since the middle of the 19th century that birds have a magnetic sense. When I was in college in the 1970s and took ornithology, we were taught that birds had tiny little magnetic deposits called magnetite, magnetic iron crystals, in their beak or in their brain. Well, it turns out those actually aren't magnetic iron crystals. They're probably part of the bird's immune system, has nothing to do with navigation. And in fact, the explanation for how birds can navigate using the Earth's magnetic field is just too weird for words. And it grows out of Albert Einstein's equations, but it was an aspect of quantum physics that he thought was so strange he more or less disowned it. It's called quantum entanglement. And what I'm about to give you is a layman's understanding of this because I am not a quantum physicist. Do we have any quantum physicists here? Okay, good. Although I've done this talk and had somebody put their hand up, so I think I'm good. All right, so let's say you're a summer tanager like this one, and you're flying north, you've taken off from the Yucatan Peninsula, you're heading across the Gulf of Mexico. As you're flying through the night sky, a photon of light emitted from a far distant star enters your eye and strikes a protein molecule, a pigment molecule called cryptochrome. And the eyes of migratory birds are filled with cryptochrome. And hits that cryptochrome molecule, and it knocks an electron off of it, and it knocks it into an adjacent cryptochrome molecule. In quantum terms, those two molecules are now quantumly entangled. They are essentially one thing. They're called a radical pair. And we are told by people who supposedly know more about quantum physics than I do that if you move those two molecules anywhere in the universe, what affects one will instantaneously affect the other. They are one thing. Now, supposedly that's going to give us unhackable quantum computers and faster-than-light communication and teleportation. But what it does in the eye of the bird is it also magnetizes these two linked pigment molecules, just for a fraction of a second. So you now have magnetically sensitive pigment molecules in the eye of the bird. And as it's flying north through the Earth's ever-changing magnetic field, it's able to see it. Do you know what I would give to see the Earth's magnetic field? It must be amazing. Every yellow-rumped warbler that's hopping around out there can probably see that, and we can't. All of which is amazing enough, but every time we think we understand what the limits of migration are, the birds blow right past them. For example, in 2013, scientists in Switzerland were curious about where alpine swifts like this one went for the winter. They knew they went to Africa, but they weren't sure about the route. They weren't sure where exactly in Western Africa they were staying. So they captured a bunch of them and fitted them with little backpack harnesses and a little data logger that had a geolocator in there that would record where the bird was, and when it came back the next year, they'd be able to download the data and see what the bird's route was. And it also had a tiny little accelerometer in there that would record how much of the bird's day was spent flying, how much of the bird's day was spent resting. They had that information for the breeding grounds. They wanted that for the wintering grounds. So they sent them off on their way. They fly to Africa, they come back to Switzerland the next year, always come back to the same place to nest. They recapture these birds, they download the data, say, oh yes, look at that. They're flying down across the Sahara Desert, down into the into the bulge of Western Africa, and then coming back across Gibraltar in the spring. Let's look at the accelerometer data. Holy crap, look at the accelerometer data. Because according to the accelerometers, these birds never stopped flying for 7 months. Continuous powered flight for 7 months, the whole way south to Africa, the whole winter that they were there, and all the way back in the spring. Now, swifts are the most aerial of all birds. They eat on the wing, they mate on the wing, unlike most birds. If they could figure out a way to incubate eggs on the wing, I'm sure they would. But come on, 7 months? But then 2 years later, scientists in Sweden did the same thing with common swifts, and turns out they're on the wing for 10 months at a stretch. Just in the last month or so, scientists here in the US published a paper showing that our black swifts from Western North America do essentially the same thing when they're traveling to South America. And if that seems unbelievable, well, then I probably shouldn't tell you about sooty terns. These birds breed on tropical islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And when a young sooty tern leaves its nesting island, it does not return to land for 4.5 or 5 years until it is old enough to breed. And for 4.5 or 5 years, they are perpetually on the wing. They are not waterproof. They can land just for a fraction of a moment on the surface of the ocean, but they can't rest there for any length of time. So for 4.5 or 5 years, they are constantly in flight, plucking food from the surface of the ocean, drinking seawater and filtering the salt out with special glands in their head, putting half of their brain to sleep for a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes at a time and just going back and forth. It's called unihemispheric sleep, just bouncing consciousness back and forth across the hemispheres of their brain. What migratory birds can teach us, I think we've just barely scratched the surface. If we only leave enough of this world undamaged and functioning to keep them going. All of these precious birds, and they're all precious. Every one of these is at once utterly ordinary and extraordinary, crossing immensities of distance through dangers that we can barely comprehend, shaped by millions of years of natural selection. And that's always been enough, but not anymore. For better or worse, their fate is in our hands. And that's one of the reasons that I'm very pleased to be doing this evening with Mass Audubon, because Mass Audubon has been doing so much for so long for migratory birds. Listen, I've talked enough. Let me stop this, and we can have a seat here and maybe answer some questions. Thank you all very much.
That was fascinating, enthralling.
Well, if you can't make migratory birds exciting, you probably shouldn't get up in front of people. But.
You know, when I think about migration, Scott, I think about just how much it tells us about how connected we all are,
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
Not only that, but how fragile ecosystems are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think on the positive side, it's about how resilient these birds are that are making these amazing migratory paths every year.
That's right, and I think one of the things that gives me a great deal of hope is that birds have nature in general and birds in particular have a track record of remarkable resiliency. If we give them half a chance, they can usually come fighting back again. I mean, frankly, we probably don't deserve that kind of grace given what we've done to the planet. But to come back to your point about connectivity, I think one of the important parts, and I'm totally stealing this from John Fitzpatrick, who's the recently retired head of the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell, that basically if you create a world that's functioning for birds, it's functioning for everything else. If you save the world for birds, it saves the world for everything. Because, as you say, the birds, they've got these global migrations. They're delicately balanced on distance and time and weather and resources. And if all of that is working, it's going to work for everything else, including us.
Look, Scott, what are we not going to be seeing tonight? We're at the height of migration. You have a sense of what's going to happen this evening. Tell me.
Well, actually, the rain's coming in, so probably not a whole lot of migration happening tonight. But we're just coming to the point where the heaviest movement of neotropical migrants, the warblers and vireos and tanagers and orioles and such. I was just this past week I was down on the coast of Georgia on one of the sea islands down there doing guiding, and it's like getting that little bit of a jump start. The birds that are down there are going to be here in another week and a half or so. And look, I'm learning to be a hardy New Englander. I've spent most of my life in Pennsylvania, but my God, the winters are long and gray and monochromatic up here. And after a while, even chickadees lose their charm. And so I'm ready for some colorful ready for some colorful warblers. So they're coming.
I agree. Coming from Washington, D.C., I feel it. Yeah. So, I looked at that report from Cornell, largely.
Yeah.
And this is the report that said we've lost 3 billion birds since the year I was born, 1970. And you look at the declines, and you go, God, how can you have hope?
Except...
I want to know. What? No, go.
Okay.
Go, tell
Well, I
me.
was just going to say,
Yeah.
so there's two ways of looking at that. One is that we lost a third of our birds. The other is that we've kept 2/3 of our birds, despite everything that's happened in the last half century. Again, I think that speaks better to the birds, perhaps, than it does to us. And I've had that conversation even with people like Ken Rosenberg and Pete Mara and some of the other authors on that paper. And but here's something that's come out of that paper. Many of the same folks that were authors of that paper have started something called Road to Recovery, R2R. And they said, all right, what do we have to do to bring back those 3 billion birds that we lost? Because we're not just going to sit around on our hands and wait. We've got to move on this. And so this all happened right around the time the pandemic hit. So to date, the Road to Recovery process has primarily been virtual conferences and workshops involving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conservationists and social scientists and land managers all across primarily North America and down into the neotropics, and doing this in a very methodical way. Like, okay, what do we know we don't know? What do we don't know that we don't know? Where are the knowledge gaps? Where are the implementation gaps? So, like, what technologies do we need right now? Let's do a moonshot. What are the things we don't know? How are we going to figure these out? And things have been moving very, very rapidly. There's a lot of good that's been coming out of that. And in fact, the book I'm working on right now that I've got like the next year and a half to finish is about what's working for birds and bird conservation around the world. Because at scales large and small, there is a lot of good that is being accomplished on behalf of bird conservation. I mean, I'm a conservationist, and by nature that means you tend to focus on the things that you're at the point of losing. I mean, with conservation, our losses are often permanent and our victories are often temporary. But I think because of that, we tend to lose sight of what is possible. And it's important for us to recognize that we can change things for the better. So.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm a total optimist when it comes to this.
Good.
Even with the science, I am optimistic about the future.
Good.
And I looked at, when you were describing the wetland birds, right? The waterfowl, right? We have friends here in the audience who love waterfowl, I know. And waterfowl have succeeded because there was a concerted social effort that was then buoyed by policy and money and resources to bring back waterfowl.
Right.
We don't have that same constituency.
Right. We don't have that.
For non-game birds.
Not as much, unfortunately.
And
we don't.
we need to build that. And what Pete's talking about, and Pete Mara, who's behind this work, is building that constituency on a hemispheric basis, which I think we should all be a part of.
Right. And one way that we can move that ahead is you should all be contacting your senators and your congressmen about the Restoring America's Wildlife Act, known as RAWA, which would provide about $1.4 billion to state and tribal governments for for wildlife conservation and land conservation every year. We've never had that kind of dedicated funding stream, and we've come close in the past with other bills that kind of eventually foundered in Congress. This is looking possible, but they need to hear from you. So, go thou and lobby your representative for RAWA.
$14 million a year on an annual basis to Massachusetts, by the way.
That's huge.
So, huge. So tell me, can you talk about the bar-tailed godwit?
God, I love bar-tailed godwits.
It is fascinating.
Okay, all right. So we're talking about a bird here. It's a shorebird. The godwits are among the largest of shorebirds, about the size of a pigeon. Long, straight beak, long legs. Bar-tailed godwits breed across Eurasia, but there's one population that has crossed the Bering Strait and colonized western and northern Alaska. And in the fall, these birds gather along the Bristol Bay side of the Alaska Peninsula and just binge feed. It's called hyperphagia. They just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat, and they become grotesquely fat. They jiggle when they walk. They feel like a water balloon in the hand. They've got so much fat under the skin. And so having gained as much weight as they possibly can, they no longer need their digestive system, so they get rid of it in a matter of days. Their stomach, their intestines, to a lesser extent their liver and kidneys atrophy dramatically. So their guts are shrinking at the same time that their breast muscles are increasing by 50% in mass and their heart muscles are increasing 30 to 50%. And they're doing this without exercise. Sign me up for that pill. And in fact, actually, I was just contacted by a human physiologist who thinks she's figured out how the birds are doing it, which means we might be able to figure out how the people are doing it. But anyway, they wait for the passage of a huge cold front with gale force winds, 80 or 100 mile an hour winds, that slingshot them out into the Pacific Ocean, and then these birds fly from Alaska to New Zealand across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean. It takes them up to 11 days of continuous, constant, powered flight. Again, unihemispheric sleep, going to, that half goes to sleep for 4 seconds, and then that half goes back, and they just, and then they finally land in New Zealand, having flown 8,100 miles, regrow their guts, and start to eat again. And they spend the austral summer in New Zealand and the coast of Australia. And then in March and April, the whole process starts again. They eat and eat and eat, balloon up in fat, their guts shrink down, they fly 6,000 miles from New Zealand and Australia to the Yellow Sea in China, which we talked about, regrow their guts, eat, balloon up, guts shrink down, 4,000 miles back to Alaska. They do this for up to 30 years. Wow. They will have flown from here. You wish you were a birder now, don't you? They will have flown the distance from here to the moon and most of the way back again by the time they die. And if you perturb any one of those three places, the coast of Alaska, the Firth of Thames in New Zealand, or the Yellow Sea in China, whole thing falls apart. But that is, I have watched bar-tailed godwits on their nesting grounds in western Alaska and tried to imagine what it must be like for a young bar-tailed godwit on its first migration, because mom and dad are gone. They leave before the young are even fully flighted. So the young godwits are making this flight entirely on their own. Whole bunch of teenagers going off on a road trip, 8,100 miles, 11 days across the widest part of the biggest ocean on the planet, and doing it all on instinct. I mean, how can you not be excited by this stuff?
I don't know. You have to be. So, well, one last question, then I want to open it up for questions. I was on the BirdLife International board, and I was in Cambridge the time the Chinese government announced.
Oh, yes.
And it was, big, huge party. I mean,
it
was unbelievable.
Well, because it came out of nowhere.
It came out of nowhere.
It came out of nowhere.
Tell me, what is the diagnostics on that? Why did it happen?
There's a couple of things.
Yeah.
There was a lot of international pressure. Yeah. There was a lot of lobbying going on within China from Chinese conservationists. I think a crucial part of this was the Paulson Institute, the American think and do tank, as they call themselves, that former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson started, which in 2018, I want to say, no, excuse me, in 2016, came out with what they called a blueprint for coastal conservation, where they made the case to the Chinese government, not only the conservation value of these tidal flats, but also the climate resiliency value of them in the face of rising sea levels, and the fact that tens of millions of Chinese citizens make their living from those mudflats, from the rich finfish and shellfish resources out there. And most of this coastal destruction was happening at the local level, at the county level. There were local officials who were getting rich, putting in shrimp farms and building factories at the risk of landscape level changes and losses. And I guess that's one good thing about a totalitarian government. One person makes a decision and the whole country has to abide by it. But I think it was a combination of all of those things. But I give the Paulson Institute a lot of credit, because they were lobbying and working the levers of power, especially some of the mid-level Chinese officials that were in a position to really make sure that Xi Jinping heard about this.
Yeah, amazing. And, obviously globally impactful.
Yeah.
Well, let's open it up. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
What impact, if any, does
Oh.
You speak to the microphone that way.
what impact, if any, does the increasing number of wind tunnels have on bird migration?
Wind turbines.
Because they have they've been reported to have some effect, and I wondered.
They
since
do.
This is an increasing industry, and I think it must have all over the world.
It is, and it's increasing. It's going to increase dramatically off the coast, off the northeastern coast, off the eastern coast, because the Biden administration has opened up wind leases along a lot of the Atlantic seaboard. So there's a couple of things here. There's no question that wind development has an impact on birds. Badly sited wind turbines can kill birds. That there's also an avoidance effect with some birds. Some birds just don't like gigantic things in their habitat, and they tend to avoid them. On the other hand, we've wasted the last 40 years when we should have been dealing with climate change, and we didn't do a whole hell of a lot, and now the house is on fire. And I have come to think that we're kind of at a point where we've got to be reaching for all the arrows in the quiver, and it's tough. So I do think that we need to be thoughtful about where we site wind development. There are some places, like, for example, offshore wind development in parts of the Great Lakes, like Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, I think is a terrible place to put them because of the number of birds crossing the lake at relatively low altitudes. Unfortunately, the Canadian government seems determined to put large-scale wind development on the Canadian side of both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. But, the thing is, climate change is affecting bird migration already, and that rate of change is only going to increase if we don't get warming under some control. I mentioned those semi-palmated sandpipers that breed in the eastern and central Canadian Arctic. That part of the world, because this is one of the weird things about global warming, is it doesn't warm evenly everywhere. And in fact, in some places, it can actually get colder at certain times of the year. And the eastern and central Canadian Arctic in late winter and early spring is now dramatically colder and snowier than it was 50 years ago. And midsummer is dramatically hotter. So when shorebirds like Hudsonian godwits that winter in the southern tip of South America and have just flown 9,000 miles to come back to Cape Churchill in Manitoba, or red-necked phalaropes that were wintering off the Pacific coast of South America and have flown all the way back, they get there and everything's still frozen and the snow is deep and the ice is thick, and they wait and they wait and they wait, and suddenly it finally melts and they can start to nest, and they produce their chicks, and bam, the climate gets dramatically warmer, and now the insects that their chicks are going to need to survive respond to that early, intense summer warming, and they emerge earlier than on schedule. So the birds are nesting later, the bugs are coming out earlier, and you have what's called a phenological mismatch, where by the time the chicks need them, the bugs are gone, and many years, only 5 or 6% of the Hudsonian godwit chicks survive because there just isn't enough to eat. So if we're not careful, if we don't get a grip on warming, we're going to be seeing a lot more of that stuff starting to happen. So,
Scott, do we have a sense of whether or not the birds can adapt quickly enough to this change?
The key term there is quickly enough.
Yeah.
I mean, the birds can adapt. They've gone through huge swings in the climate in the past. The changes are happening so fast. We know that if we give them half a chance, they can. Yeah. One of the best examples of a phenological mismatch, sort of like the gold standard example, is the pied flycatcher in Europe, which migrates from tropical Africa back to the oak forests of Central and Western Europe. And they time their migration so they can come back and have their chicks, and the chicks are at their hungriest at the point in springtime when the leaves have emerged from the oak trees and the seasonal peak in caterpillar numbers are at the highest, because a typical nest of 4 chicks for an insectivorous bird requires about 6,000 caterpillars. And starting in the mid-'80s, as the spring was getting earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier, the birds are coming back on the timetable that's baked into their DNA, and they were falling farther and farther behind. And they got so far behind that their population crashed by more than 50% in the UK, up to 90% in some parts of Europe. But then, and I was just talking recently to the scientist, a fellow named Christian Both in the Netherlands, who's done most of the seminal research on this. The warming trend at the critical point in the spring, in late April and early May in Central Europe, paused. Now, he stressed this does not mean global warming stopped. It just means that in Europe, at that critical time of the year, the rapid warming slowed down, but it gave the birds a chance to catch up. And in the last 10 or 15 years, these birds have actually evolved an earlier arrival time, and their numbers are back up again. So, again, things like this give me hope, but not every bird is going to have that ability. Not every bird's going to be lucky enough to be in a place where, global change slows down a little bit to let it catch up. Our job as conservationists is to slow the train wreck that's happening with climate change and to provide the resources and protect the habitats and the food that these birds need to try to get them through this keyhole.
Yeah, totally. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So last year we were advised, I think by Audubon, to not put out bird feeders because there was some kind of weird disease. So I didn't put my bird feeders out. And then I know from the work I used to do before I retired that avian bird flu, which I think mostly affects chickens, but that's a big concern. And periodically there's a lot of drama around it, and then for some reason it doesn't really happen. But is this a threat to migratory birds too, or is this an anomaly? And
So it's a couple of different things. So the disease that emerged last year in the mid-Atlantic and spread out, we still don't have an explanation for that. It was affecting mostly young birds that had recently left the nest. I've got good friends who are wildlife pathologists and veterinarians who were working on this, and they tested everything they could possibly think of, but they never found a cause for it. And then it just sort of died off and disappeared. Avian influenza is a different thing, and it is if you're a chicken farmer, it is a serious issue, and it is widespread among waterfowl. The snowy owls we study, we lost a lot of snowy owls in the Northeast this year from avian influenza. There's only been 1 or 2 cases among people. This strain is not particularly dangerous to people, but it is deadly to many birds, and it's probably going to be here for a while. The one thing it's not affecting are songbirds or feeder birds. So while there have been some recommendations for people to take their feeders in, there's really no reason that I've heard for that. And the people whom I know who are working on HPA, highly pathogenic avian influenza, have said, no, you should keep your feeders clean. And for those of us who live in bear country, you should take them down this time of the year anyway, because otherwise you're going to lose your feeder. But it's not really a problem. The avian influenza thing's not really a problem for feeder birds.
has it always been around?
It is, yeah. I mean, influenza is a bird disease. And in fact, the strains of influenza that hit us usually are percolating between pigs and domestic waterfowl and people, often largely in Asia, where folks in rural areas have all 3 of those, and they're constantly trading back and forth viruses. But avian influenza is very, very common among birds. It's just that this is an unusually, for birds, an unusually dangerous strain. And even ducks usually just, they're endemic carriers of avian influenza that it rarely affects, but a lot of ducks have died from this strain, and it's awful because it causes neurological problems. They're kind of writhing around and flopping, and they can go from perfectly healthy to dead in about 6 hours. It is a nasty disease. Happy stuff to talk about.
The back, and then. Yes.
Sorry, I'll give that to you next. Thank you, Scott. Your enthusiasm is infectious.
As opposed to avian influenza.
Yeah. I remember the 9,045 species of birds from my scant biology. How many bird species now do we
know and record and protect?
They usually say about 10,500 worldwide.
And how many of those are migratory birds?
Only about 20% are migratory. Most birds are non-migratory because they live in tropical habitats or more stable habitats. But actually, there we're finding that many of these birds we didn't think were migratory are moving seasonally, maybe not thousands of miles, but many of them will move hundreds of or thousands of feet in elevation, like for example in the Andes, or across hundreds of miles of tropical forest, moving seasonally, perhaps as fruit ripens in different areas of the Amazon, moving around.
Your talk makes me think that there's a calling for conservation, for birds to teach humans about climate change, what birds need, and why they may lose what they need to live and to propagate. Because these 20% of the birds, 20% of 10,000 birds fly over most of the earth.
That's true.
And they communicate, if you will, with a good percentage of the world's population. You could, through birds as vectors, tell people a little bit more about the complexities of climate change. I'm just wondering, do you know of any educational thrusts in that direction?
I'm going to defer to my colleague over here, or my wife.
Yes, exactly. But Amy's much better at answering this question than I, but I will just say to start that the opportunity to talk about climate change through the lens of birds are there, and we are tapping into that. There are somewhere on the order of 50 million birders in the United States. Imagine coalescing that energy around climate change policies that will affect people, wildlife, and birds. We haven't coalesced it, but there's a tremendous amount of education work that's going on right now to talk about the effects of climate change on birds and therefore the impacts it has on ecology and on people. Amy, why don't you chime in here?
Sure. So, hold on. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, birds are an incredible gateway to deeper conservation and connection. So, I mean, at Mass Audubon, we use birds all the time as a hook to engage people in thinking beyond that particular individual bird or that species, but where it is in the habitat, what's it's facing, what are the changes, what are the impacts, what are the behaviors, what are the needs. So, birds are an incredible way to hook people, to hook people into taking action, to care for the planet. They're incredible. They're everywhere. I've been doing bird education or bird conservation more broadly for, more than 20 years, and birds are everywhere. I can go and be at Logan Airport and engage people with birds. I can be at Brewster's Woods and engage people with birds. I could be in this parking lot probably right now and talk about, the magic of bird migration and how that, and make it relevant to all of us. So we do that all the time at Mass Audubon. That's what we've been doing for 126 years. Birds are incredible. They're a great hook.
Scott, birds sound like they stay in a very narrow lane. They migrate from a point that's 3,000 miles away from another point, and that's all they know how to do. And if they have to stop at a certain place on the way, and that place disappears, they're in trouble. So I guess my question is, and maybe it wasn't all, meadow destruction. Maybe the 3 billion birds that don't exist anymore, maybe their pathways were taken away. And so my question is, in the ultimate end game of adaptation, are birds able to not go back to that forest where those oaks had that certain caterpillar? And there's plenty of food on the planet. They don't just have to eat that food.
Well, except you got to remember that birds aren't making a conscious decision about what they're going to eat. They're the end point of millions of years of evolution that says you hunt for a certain kind of food in a certain place in a certain way. I mean, if you watch shorebirds along the coast, you'll see different species are feeding on different things in different ways in different places. It's called resource partitioning. So they're not all kind of under each other's foot. You have some with long skinny legs and long bills that are probing deep, and others with short bills that are picking up food at the surface, and some shorebirds that are wading in water and probing, and some that are up near the high tide line, and ruddy turnstones are flipping stuff over and looking what's under there. And it might be asking a bit much for them to, to ask them to stop and think, sit back and say, well, yeah, there's not a lot of polycate worms here left. How are you with seeds? Oh, well, you don't really have a bill that's built for eating seeds. I mean, we have some species that are very generalists. I mean, crows and grackles. There's a lot of birds that can eat a lot of different things, but there are some birds that are quite specialized. And even warblers, which are mostly insect-eating birds, will hunt in different parts of a tree. There's a classic study from the Maine coast, Doug Morse and Robert MacArthur and scientists over the years that have looked at how different species of wood warblers will kind of partition up a spruce tree. Some of them hunt insects by hover gleaning out at the tips of the branches and plucking insects, and others are in the top third of the tree or in the bottom third of the tree or close to the trunk or out. There's lots of different ways, and that's baked into their DNA. It's difficult for birds to change. But within any population, you have some outliers. Some of them are born with kind of screwy software, and they're doing different things. And that's nature's way of always throwing a little bit of spaghetti at the wall to see if something sticks. But all of these changes that are coming at birds are coming fast. Climate change is coming fast. Habitat loss is coming fast. God, I just in the process of doing a story for Cornell's Living Bird magazine about the effects of pesticides on birds. Yes. Chemical contamination is just slamming birds. I think that's where a lot of those 3 billion birds went. Yes. I mean, it's just, it's death by 1,000 cuts with these birds, which makes it hard for us as conservationists because we've just got so many targets we've got to focus on. We've got to keep our head down and keep a focus on it. Peter's going to go nuts here if we don't.
Well, we're gonna take 2 more questions. Peter,
I'll be very quick. I'm a book writer, and I am involved with a book called The Magic of Birds that is not for the birder, it's for the novice. And what I've found, and I'm trying to work this into the book, is that due to COVID, you get people talking about birds over the meat counter, the backyard. And while you were talking, there's a huge population of birds that is increasing. The turkeys.
Yes.
The red-tailed hawks. The cardinals.
Yes.
And so what I'm hoping is that through this sort of novice, common, I love birds, hope is the thing with feathers, right. Emily Dickinson, we can get more of a population involved, right. Because people are hearing more and more and more the concerns, but they love their birds.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing up raptor. And you mentioned red-tailed hawks. Raptor populations are up 80% in the last 50 years. So, I mean, it's not all gloom and doom.
And I have to add that, this is a moment where we have more people connecting with the natural world than we ever have. At Mass Audubon, we're seeing 2-3 times as many people going out to our sanctuaries. Our membership is going and continues to increase. Small donations are up. People have just found solace, and they've connected to nature. We have to capture that energy, and we have to convert it to action to deal with these threats that we're dealing with now. So that's the hope that exists right now, and we just need to capture it and nurture it and take action with it. Peter, we need you to have the final question.
We don't have bar-tailed godwits in Concord, but we have a little bird called the black-polled warbler, which comes here from eastern Siberia, Alaska, the Yukon, the Canadian Arctic, boreal forests. And they fatten up here in September, lots of them in our trees. And it was described by Vernon Locke, some of you may have known from the Vineyard in Cape Cod and Nantucket. And he describes what the black-polled warbler, what happens to them, as you mentioned so succinctly on the bar-tailed godwit. The different body organs do, get smaller, but they add 50% of their weight, and he describes it as subcutaneous fat, just under the skin. You can blow in his feathers, and you'll see his big globs of yellowy goo down there. And it breaks down into 2 things, energy and water. And these birds, once they catch a northwest wind, like you were describing, Scott, at their back, they fly over to Bermuda on certain days in September and early October. And when they get to Bermuda, and they haven't seen land for 1,000 miles, they don't stop. If they have enough fat, if it's been good enough here, enough caterpillars, they don't stop. They've got enough food and water, and then they pick up the trade winds and end up on the coast of Venezuela 5 days later. The little black-polled warbler does the same thing in a smaller scale, which is great.
Yeah.
But my question is, I spent a recent summer up in the high Canadian Arctic, and we stood under the North Magnetic Pole. The North Magnetic Pole is not at the North Pole. It wanders and wanders and wanders around. And currently, the North Magnetic Pole has been moving from Baffin Island up to Axel Heiberg Island and is headed to Siberia. I stood under the North Magnetic Pole and didn't feel a damn thing. But anyways, I'm just wondering, as this moves over towards Siberia, as it wanders around, might that affect the navigation of some of our birds?
Probably not, interestingly enough, because the birds, when the birds are sensing the Earth's magnetic field, they're not keying in on the polarity. They're not keying in the north and south aspect of it. What they're able to visualize is the angle at which the Earth's magnetic field is emerging from the Earth's surface. If you cast your minds back to your middle school Earth Sciences course, when you had a picture of the Earth with the belts of radiation coming out, the angle changes as you get closer and closer to the poles versus the equator. And that appears to be part of what the bird is keying in on with its magnetoreception. There's another magnetic reception skill that birds have, another sense that they have that we have not quite cracked yet, which is a map sense. And there's some suspicion that the birds are using the trigeminal nerve, which runs through the upper mandible and the upper beak, that's giving them their map sense. So not so much the north, south, east, west, but the ability, for example, if they're picked up and moved 1,000 kilometers to the west and released, that they can reorient and get back on track. Because if you sever that trigeminal nerve and do that, the birds can't correct.
Amazing.
So, I'm sorry.
No,
this is what happens when you get me going on this stuff.
We'll have to take questions informally, right? First of all, Tom, thank you. We're very, very pleased to be a partner. We feel fortunate to be a part of the Live with Birds and this extraordinary exhibit and this series of events. So thank you very much. And to Scott, wow, that was awesome.
It's been a
Thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Really, really good.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah.